So next up we have Sam Bellen from Auth0 itself. And he's going to talk about protecting your Angular applications using Auth0.
Thank you all for joining me today, and thank you for inviting me to this wonderful conference. I'm going to be taking 15 minutes of your time to talk about protecting your Angular applications with Auth0. Yes, no, maybe? Then we'll do it like this. Let me quickly introduce myself. My name is Sam Bellen. I'm from Belgium, and I'm a developer advocate engineer at Auth0, as just introduced. If you don't know Auth0 or you're curious about what we do, we have a booth right at the end of this hall with my colleague Ben. So come talk to us after this talk or whenever you have some time, and we'll explain to you what we do. It's basically authentication made easy for everybody. I'm a Google developer expert, and you can find me on the internet, including Twitter, as @SamBego. So, I'm a developer, I'm a JavaScript developer, so it only seems logical to me that I should be npm installable. So if you're on npx@sambego/about me, download half of the internet, you can find all the links to my social media and to my slides right there in your CLI. If you'd like to follow along with these slides on your device, or you'd like to see them again after this talk, they're available at ng.sambego.tech. I'll share this link again after the talk as well. But let's get started. In this talk, we're going to see a quick summary of OpenID Connect. We're going to look at the authorization code with PXE Flow, and lastly, we're going to see how you can protect your applications, your Angular applications using Auth0. So, quickly, OpenID Connect. When you want to protect your single-page applications these days, OpenID Connect is often used as a framework of doing authentication for single-page applications. And what is OpenID Connect? OpenID Connect was created as an identity layer on top of Auth 2.0. So everything that you know of Auth 2.0, all of the flows are also available in OpenID Connect, but it also adds an identity layer on top, which means that we can also know which user has authenticated with us through OpenID Connect in the form of an ID token. That's all I wanted to say about OpenID Connect, but just remember that it's built on top of Auth, and it also uses all of the same flows, including the authorization code with PXE Flow. And if you've never heard of PXE before, it stands for Authorization Code with Proof Key for Code Exchange. And it's a very long term, it's a lot of very fancy words, but I'm going to try to explain to you how this flow works in a bit more detail. So in this schematic, we have 4 entities. We have a user, we have our application, we have Auth0 or whatever authorization server you're using, and you have your API. And there's going to be a back and forth between some of these in every step of the way. So the first step is the user is going to click on a login link because the user wants to log in on your application. Once the user does this, with the PXE Flow, we're going to generate a code verifier and a code challenge. The code verifier is just a random piece of data, and the code challenge is a SHA-256 hash of that random data. But we're going to generate these in our application. We're going to keep these in memory, and we're going to use these in the next steps in our authentication process. So once we generated that code verifier and code challenge, the next step would be that we request an authorization code, and we also send the code challenge to our /authorize endpoint. So we're going to ask Auth0, can you please give me an authorization code that I can later use to get my actual access token, ID token, whatever tokens you need. And when we ask for this code, this authorization code, we're also going to pass along the code challenge to Auth0, so we can remember this, and we could do some verifying based on that challenge later on. Once Auth0 has received your authorization challenge and has created that authorization code, it's going to send back that authorization code to your application, which you can then use in the next few steps. So you're going to use this code to request a few tokens, including an access token. So what we do then is send that authorization code together with the code verifier. The code verifier we created in the second step, and we send that to the OAuth/token endpoint. These are default OAuth and OpenID Connect endpoints, so if you're using something else on Auth0, these might also be the same endpoints for you. If you use something that's not standard, you might look a bit different, but the flow will remain the same for most authorization servers out there, including home build, including open source, including other commercial products. So we sent the authorization code that we received in 2 steps back, together with the code verifier that we generated in the second step, and we send that as a fetch request, as a post request, to the /OAuth/token endpoint of our authorization server. And the authorization server is then going to check if that code challenge that we sent in the beginning and that code verifier, if they match. if they are okay. And if they do match, if they're all compatible, if they're the right code verifier and the code challenge, we can then give back some access token, maybe an ID token, sometimes a refresh token, depends on how you have built your authorization server and your authorization flow, and depends also on your application, because sometimes you need a refresh token and sometimes you don't. But if you get this access token, ID token, and a refresh token, this also means that you can use them. So once you've got that access token, for example, you can use it to request some data to your API. An access token is usually used with, to get access to API endpoints, and an ID token is usually used by application, your Angular application, to show some user identifiable information like a username or a picture. And a refresh token is used to refresh your access tokens, because access tokens often are very short-lived. So once they expire, you want to request a new refresh token, a new access token using your refresh token. That was real short of how the Pixie flow works. It's the standard authorization code flow from Auth or OpenID Connect, but with Pixie on top, which means that we created that code verifier and that code challenge, and we send both of them in different steps so we can verify that they have been sent, that they match in one of the later steps. So the last part is, how do we do this using Auth0 and Angular? The first thing we need to do is set up our SDK, the Auth0 SDK, in our Angular application. So we're going to do ng-add Auth0/Auth0 Angular. It's the first step, right? We need to be able to use the Auth0 SDK. Once we've done so, we also want to configure a few environment variables, things like your Auth0 tenant domain and your Auth0 application client ID. I've done this in an auth_config.json. You can do this in an .n file. Doesn't matter, as long as you know how to use these environment variables. That's good to go. Once you've done so, you want to import the domain and client ID from your environment configurable variables and add them to the production or the development environment variables. And lastly, we need to import the auth module from Auth0/Auth0 Angular and import her in our main application modules .ts file. So in our imports, we see that we do Auth0 module.forRoot, and there we paste in these environment variables that we've created in the previous few slides, which is our Auth0 tenant, or Auth0 domain, and our client ID, so Auth0 knows which application it needs to do authentication for. Cool, we've done all of the basic setup. So let's actually log in some users. And this isn't that difficult. The first thing we want to do in this example is create a login button. You can do this in a separate component. You can do this any way you like. I did it in a separate component. And it's quite simple. It just imports the Auth service from our SDK. It creates a new button. And it creates a new method called login with redirect, which will call the this.auth.login with redirect method from our SDK. And that will take care of all of the login logic that needs to happen to log in with Auth0. We also want to have it as a button, so our template is going to look something like this, just a button with a click handler that uses that login with redirect method. But once you've done so, you can add that login button anywhere in your application, wherever you want it. For example, I've added it to my main navigation. And you can also do some conditional ng-if on it. If the user is authenticated, I want to show the login button. If the user is not authenticated, I want to show the login button. And if they are authenticated, if they are logged in, well, it doesn't make sense to show a login button because they're already logged in, right? And lastly, we also want to inject the auth service into our navbar component just so we can get access to that previous auth.isAuthenticated observable, so we know when the user is authenticated or not. Cool, we added login in just a few slides. You basically just inject the auth service from your Auth0 SDK and call login with redirect, and you're good to log in just a few lines of code. Log out is just the exact same thing. You create a new, or I created a new logout button, which also injects that auth service, and instead of calling auth service of this.auth.login with redirect, it's just going to call the logout method. And that logout method that expects a little bit of a configuration, and in this case, where to return to when the user has logged out, because to log out, you're going to redirect to Auth0 and redirect back to your application, so you can specify which location to redirect back to once the user has successfully logged out. In this instance, we use the document to get the current origin of the current page that the user is on, so we can just redirect user back to where they came from, but you can basically redirect to any page in your application that you feel is right for you. And lastly, again, we need a template, so a button that has a click handler that does that logout method, that calls that logout method. But it's just as simple as this. You set up the Auth0 SDK, you import it, and then you import the Auth0 auth service to call both login with redirect, logout, and you can also call a few of the other methods that I won't go through in this talk because we only have 15 minutes. But with just a few lines of code and Auth0, you can protect your applications in a very easy and quick way. You can do user authentication in a quite easy way. So let's see what we just built hypothetically on slides. I have built this for real in a demo application. As you can see, we have a very standard Angular sample project with a home, a profile, external API button, but also that login button that we created in the previous slides. So once I click on this login button, it should do something. But I might not have internet. But it's basically going to redirect me to Auth0. There we go, it's just a bit slow. And then Auth0 is going to take care of all of the complex login handling if you have second factor authentication, social login, single sign-on, all of those kind of things. You don't have to worry about those. We deal with those, and your users can just log in. So if I log in with Google, for example, you might have to wait a little bit until the Google thingy loads. But if I click on my email address, and we wait a few more seconds, I should be able to log in with just my Gmail address in our own application. As you can see, we just did the same thing, but instead of having a login button on the top right corner, now we have a logout button. And that's the exact same button that we made in the previous slides as well. So we made a login button that does the redirect to Auth0, and Auth0 handles all of the authentication. And the login button is also going to redirect you to Auth0/logout, log out the user, finish their sessions, and come back to your application. And it's quite fast because we're already back on the login page. So it's as easy as just calling a few methods from our SDK, and you can get up and running with Auth0. So let's recapitulate. OpenID Connect is Auth2, which is an identity layer on top. The identity layer is the ID token, which gives you a bit more information about which user has actually authenticated, which is not part of Auth itself. It's OpenID Connect. Single-page applications use the authorization code with PXE flow, which is the standard Auth authorization code where you request an authorization code and then exchange that code for a token or a set of tokens. But we added PXE to that, which is a proof key for code exchange, which is basically that code verifier and that code challenge that we send in different steps to our authorization code, so we can verify that the authorization process is started by the same application, the same user as the application that has finished it, that is requesting the tokens in the end. So it's a bit more secure. And lastly, implementing authentication with Auth0 just takes a few minutes, a few lines of code. You import the SDK, you import the Auth service in your Angular application, and you call login with redirect, or you call logout, and you're good to go. You have your basic login set up for your users in just a few lines of code. These slides are available at ng.sambigo.tech. I will also tweet them later if you want to find them. They will always be here, so if you're interested, go check them out. We're running a competition at our booth here in the back of this hall. If you go to this link or you scan this QR code, you'll find a Google form, and if you sign up for a newsletter, you might win a Bluetooth speaker. I think it's a Mega Boom or something. It's quite a nice Bluetooth speaker, so we're giving this away at the end of today. And if you have any more questions, come say hi at the booth at the back of this room. That being said, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Sam. That was an amazing session on Auth0.